Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm going to be reviewing Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I had originally planned to do just like a wrap-up of books that I haven't gotten a chance to talk about yet on this channel, and just from the past few months, and this was one of those books, and then I started outlining my thoughts for this book in particular, and I realized that putting it in a wrap-up was going to force me to rush a lot of things that I wanted to say, and so I should just do a review of this book on its own, even though so many people have already talked about how much they love it, and I feel like this is just the umpteenth positive review that you're going to find of Gods of Jade and Shadow on BookTube. Let's just dive in with what Gods of Jade and Shadow is about. It's a fantasy novel set in Mexico in the 1920s. The book is centered around our heroine Cassiopeia, who is basically forced to work for her grandfather and the rest of her extended family as a maid. Like a lot of people, I loved this book, and I think a lot of that love comes down to the style that was used to build out the story and really tell it. Cassiopeia starts out this book feeling a lot like a potential Cinderella figure. She's been forced to work for her family, who are not particularly kind to her. But this is a comparison that she herself rejects early on, which sets the stage for a book that weaves in a lot of familiar elements from a variety of different stories that a lot of us have probably grown up with, but it doesn't feel like a pastiche of ill-used tropes. And to be honest, when I first thought about reviewing this book, I didn't quite know how I wanted to review it because I felt like so much of my feeling was just I loved it. I don't know how to explain that. I just know that I had this visceral reaction of loving this book. But then I read this essay by the author Silvia Moreno-Garcia. She was basically describing some of the choices that she made in writing this book, and in particular, her decision to basically focus more on telling the story versus kind of showing it, and how that was inspired by the oral tradition, both the grand existence of the oral tradition throughout history, and also her own personal experiences hearing stories from family members. And reading that essay really helped me sort of focus my thoughts on what I loved about this book, because I think that inspiration is apparent so much in the writing style. It's such a strong choice. Reading the book definitely feels like an elder who's telling you a story about a god. But also I think that choice is really apparent in a lot of the familiarity of these tropes that build out the story, but that are also incorporated in really interesting ways. This is a book where a mysterious, powerful dude commands our abused, plucky heroine into a mythological quest, and at points, this quest sets her at odds with a villainous patriarchal figure. At other points, this quest sets her and the mysterious, powerful dude who commanded her into the quest into romantic tension, where her pluckiness changes him. And when it comes to tropes, those are some of the most familiar ones to me. Those are tropes that I've read in stories since I was a little kid, right? And that is not a criticism of the book, because in general, you'd be hard pressed to find a book that is not based on familiar tropes. My interest in this list of narrative devices is not just the fact that they exist, it's how Gods of Jade and Shadow executes on them. And I think the familiarity of them is really important, and it's so in line with that idea of the oral tradition, these stories that have been handed down from generation to generation and that have influenced the tropes that we have such a range of experiences with today. And tied to that is the fact that the book doesn't just let tropes sit there uncommented on. It's actually engaged with them almost like a conversation, you are actually talking through what is happening in the story itself. So like I said earlier on, Cassiopeia has this element of feeling Cinderella. She feels like one of the most familiar fairy tales of all time, except that she rejects this comparison. And in the book itself, they make this explicit. It says, had Cassiopeia possessed her father's pronounced romantic leanings, perhaps she might have seen herself as a Cinderella-like figure. But although she treasured his old books, the skeletal remains of his collection, especially the sonnets by Quevedo, wells of sentiment for a young heart, she had decided it would be nonsense to configure herself into a tragic heroine. Of course, the reality of the story is that whether or not Cassiopeia has romantic leanings, whether or not she thinks of herself as romantic, she is caught up in a romantic story structure and character arc. But what the book sets up is a connection between that romantic mythology and the practical realities of her life, which ends up being a conversation throughout the book, often in line with those otherwise well-worn tropes. Mythological realities aren't taken for granted in the story, and the characters question the tropes that are used to push their narrative along. And that is a thing that could become grating, right? Like when a book becomes so self-referential that you're like starting to wonder like what is even the point of you existing as a text, because all you're doing is like asking yourself into a corner what any of your choices mean, like that can become insufferable. But again, I think this is a book that feels like it's being told to you, right? Like that's in line with the idea of this oral tradition where it's not just a thing that you're reading, it's a conversation, it's something that someone is telling you, and that if like they were at your bedside, like if someone was telling you a bedtime story, you could be like, hey, like I'm like, why? Like, why is this happening? Kind of like in The Princess Bride. Like, that's like a story that the grandfather's telling to his grandson, and like the grandson's like, why is this happening, right? Like, there's that sense of a conversation. There's that sense that, you know, there's something more dynamic happening. One of the trade-offs of this structure is that it can make you feel disconnected from the characters, because like, even when you're in their head, like you're seeing like what Cassiopeia's like thoughts are, how she sees the world, what things she's considering. The way that that narration is written, it can sometimes make you feel distanced from them. Like it can feel kind of like a middleman between you and the character's thoughts. But I didn't find that super frustrating as a reader, in part because the voice of the narration itself was so strong. It was very developed, it was very witty, it was very suited to the story that was being told. It was like the narrator was this unnamed character who I was just as enchanted by as everything else in this story. And the other thing that makes this book so much fun to read is just the setting. Like there's this jazz age backdrop that's super fun, it's transportive, it feels like there's all this energy going on just because there's this buzz to like the character's like era that like is like everything is changing, and you're just, yeah, it's just really exciting. And tying the story, that setting, all of that, those elements of Mexican history gives more to Cassiopeia's story. It explains why she is where she is at the beginning of the novel, and it informs the places that her journey takes her throughout the course of the book. Like it felt a lot like reading the Odyssey again, but like in a completely different era. By fleshing out that setting so well in relation to Cassiopeia's story, this ended up feeling like a book whose ending extended like way beyond the actual pages of the book. Like I finished it and I still felt like I could see where Cassiopeia's journey was continuing to go, because the whole sense of who she was in relation to her time and place all worked so well together. And related to that, like one of the things that most immediately impressed me when I was done with this book is just like how well it ended, which is like kind of a weird thing to know, but this is a standalone fantasy novel. And sometimes like standalone fantasy novels, and honestly, even like fantasy trilogies, even fantasy duologies, were like, well, I'll have this issue where like the last third just falls apart. Like there's just so much to wrap up, there's so much to explain. Like I've read so many books in that mode where I read the first 2/3 and expect to be disappointed for the last third, which is a bummer, because when you read a bad ending or even a disappointing ending, it can really like ruin your whole enjoyment of everything that you had read before it. And so it was honestly a huge surprise to me that I got to the end of this book and was just like, wow, like that was perfect. Like that was good. That is the way this book should have ended. And it was refreshing to experience that. And I think it's so connected to the choices that were made in terms of style, character, and setting, where Silvia Moreno-Garcia clearly had such a strong sense of what questions needed to be asked, and also which ones even needed to be answered. Not everything needs to be fully explained to be satisfying. And in keeping with that sense of the oral tradition, you end this book feeling like you're still talking to it, like you're still engaged with it, like there is a narrator, and like you can fully imagine just asking them like, well, what's next? And you know, maybe in another world they would tell you what's next. As you can probably tell, I love this book a lot, and I haven't read any of Silvia Moreno-Garcia's other work yet. I'm so intrigued though, because like it's clear that she writes in a lot of different genres, and I'm so impressed with like the specific choices that she made for writing this one book. Like she clearly thought through what the specific story needed in terms of like what needed to be told and how it needed to be told. So I'm really excited and intrigued to see her apply that thoughtfulness to other genres, and yeah, read more stories and just get to experience more of this writing. So thank you guys for watching. If you have recommendations for where I should start with Silvia Moreno-Garcia's other works, let me know. I'm really excited. I think Mexican Gothic is like coming out in like 2 months, pretty soon. And so I'm super excited to read that because that looks super awesome. And in the meanwhile, probably will dig up her other works. So let me know what you thought of this book. Let me know what you think of her other books. Yeah, bye.